Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It's great to see a few familiar faces starting to trickle in. And we're just going to go ahead and get started right away. So I'm Frances Ball. I'm the Chief Operations Officer at Launch Alaska. And today in our webinar, we'll be going over impact at Launch Alaska and specifically diving into our impact from 2024. So I'll cover metrics like job creation, emissions reduction, and projects deployed. We'll talk about our portfolio companies from our accelerator program and also our advocacy and deployment work. And we'll also dig into how we measure our impact, so the process that we use to compile these numbers. And before we get going, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So today I'm calling into this Zoom from Anchorage, Alaska. We're located on the traditional lands of the Dena'ina Indigenous people. On behalf of everyone at Launch Alaska, we also acknowledge all Indigenous people of Alaska. We thank them for past and present stewardship of the waters, plants, and animals of this place. So now we'll dive right in. First, some background about Launch Alaska for those of you who may not be familiar with what we do. So Launch Alaska was founded in 2016 here in Anchorage. We're a nonprofit on a mission to catalyze rapid innovation that strengthens energy, transportation, and industrial systems. So we work across our three verticals: energy, industry, and transportation, and help accelerate projects in those areas. And we envision prosperous and resilient communities, rich in economic opportunities and sustainable systems. So that is the vision we're chasing after through the work we do. This is our team, and today I'll be joined by my colleague, Matt Nejati, Deployment Principal, who will be speaking to some of our portfolio impact a little later. And Kirsten Swan and Eve Downing will be behind the scenes, helping run the webinar and helping with any questions you guys might have. These are our partners. We receive major funding support from the U.S. Department of the Navy, Office of Naval Research, and U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Technology Transitions. We're also supported by dozens of Alaska organizations, large and small, who you'll see on the screen here, from Alaska Native corporations and resource development companies to local utilities, research institutions, community groups, etc. So these are the partners who help enable the impact that you'll see on the coming slides. So our primary program at Launch Alaska is our accelerator called the Tech Deployment Track. It's an 8-month program connecting startups with partners and project opportunities in Alaska. And it's a hybrid program. So we kick it off here in Anchorage in person in the fall with what we call session 1. And then we have 2 major check-ins throughout the program, both virtual, session 2 in the late fall, and then session 3 coming up next week, actually, in March, before the end of our program in April. And that's where we decide who we'll let into our portfolio. So right now we're actually recruiting for our next tech deployment track, which kicks off this coming September, and applications close May 1st for that. So send any interesting companies our way. We have more info on our website, or you can reach out directly to myself or anyone on the team if you have a referral. So I'll go through a few stats from our tech deployment track this year, so the 24-25 program. So we had 11 companies participate in session 1 here in Anchorage last fall. Those companies represent a variety of technologies, including clean synthetic fuels, streamlined fishery monitoring services, carbon capture and storage, weather observation systems for more efficient airfield operations. Those are just a couple of them. And they came from as nearby as Wasilla, just an hour north, and as far as Kazakhstan. So we have companies joining our program from all over the world. They just have to have a reason to be in Alaska, matching up their tech with our needs. And so we start with a larger number of companies at the start of our program, so these 11, and then we winnow down that number over the next 8 months as we figure out which companies have the potential to succeed in Alaska. So we started with 11, and now we're about 6 months into the program, and we have 7 companies remaining going into session 3 next week. we had 51 volunteer advisors participate in session 1 to hear the company's pitch and provide feedback, help them generate leads. So we're looking for feedback from a diverse set of subject matter experts. So these advisors are business leaders, researchers, other subject matter experts. This year we had about a 60-40 split between men and women, and about 80% of these advisors were based in Anchorage, 15% elsewhere in Alaska, and 5% out of state. And they're helping generate leads in Alaska, so it makes sense that the majority of our advisors are here in state. So these 51 advisors generated a total of 313 leads in session 1, so about 30 per company. And these leads are potential partners, asset owners, project opportunities. So it could be an individual, an organization, et cetera, that the advisor writes down or submits online for the portfolio company as someone that that company should meet with or look into or further research. So these leads are then tracked down and validated by the companies in the months after session 1, and eventually they turn into more fleshed out project opportunities, which we call project maps. And then later, hopefully those go on to sign project commitments and deployed projects. So now nearing the end of our program, we have 9 project maps for our 7 remaining companies. So we only require 1 per company to kind of continue to this point. So they're all doing really great. We have a few have more than 1 project map. So these numbers showing cohort companies, advisors, leads, they're all part of the work that goes into accelerating portfolio projects. So, helping find the right companies, get their tech deployed in Alaska, and that contributes to the bigger impact number that we'll be sharing with you shortly. So this is our portfolio. We have 41 current companies in the portfolio, split between energy, transportation, and industry. And at the end of our program, towards the end of March each year, we determine who we'd like to invite to join the portfolio. And if you join the portfolio, it means that we will continue to support you in deploying projects in Alaska. And each year, we reevaluate this list, and some graduate if they're no longer pursuing project opportunities in Alaska. So these 41 are all active companies that have the potential to deploy their tech in Alaska or have already deployed a project. And these companies, you can see all the different names up here. They offer everything from geothermal power production to long duration energy storage, electrified transportation technologies, and a lot more. And this list is growing. So as I mentioned, we now have 7 companies remaining in our tech deployment track cohort, and we'll decide who we invite to join the portfolio and add to this list in just a few weeks. Okay, so next I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Matt, to talk about some of the highlights from a few of these portfolio companies.
Thanks, Francis. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Nejati. I'm the deployment principal here at Launch, and I work closely with many of our portfolio companies on their projects. I feel quite fortunate that I get to present this part of the show because it's where I get to share some of the really exciting success stories from our portfolio companies over this past year. First up is portfolio company Cache Energy. They have developed a long duration energy storage solution that allows for thermal energy to be stored in an environmentally stable pellet and then released again as desired or needed. This allows for seasonal and extremely long duration storage of energy. And furthermore, because the pellets are easily transportable, it allows for that stored energy to be moved to where it's most valuable or most needed. Cache demonstrated the operation of this system in a pilot project last summer in Anchorage in collaboration with Halliburton. And this happened after their completion of tech deployment track. They're continuing to demonstrate their technology and are currently running a pilot on the North Slope to prove out the viability of their tech in extreme cold temperature conditions. Next up, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Agito. Agito participated in tech deployment track in 2020-2021 before graduating to our portfolio. At that time, they were a very small team who developed a microgrid control system that integrates various energy assets together for optimal and reliable dispatch. And it was highly capable in both off-grid microgrids as well as behind-the-meter grid-tied systems. After completing multiple successful projects around the state in recent years, Nejati was acquired last year by Generac Power Systems, a global leader in energy technology solutions. By adding Nejati's control system to that portfolio, it allows Generac and Nejati to offer a more complete ecosystem of technologies for remote and grid-tied microgrid systems all over the world, including in Alaska. Finally, I want to tell you a little bit about Circle Seafoods and their work this past summer in Metlakatla. Circle Seafoods is exploring how their technology and process expertise can help communities and fishermen to catch, produce, and sell higher quality fish for higher and more sustainable prices. While continuing to build out their first floating freezer, a barge that allows for ultra low temperature round freezing and processing right on the water, they partnered with the community of Metlakatla to lease and operate the Annette Island Packing Company facility last summer. During the season, they were able to process more than 1 million pounds of salmon at that facility, and importantly, they were able to pay harvesters nearly twice the average rate for both pink and chum salmon. This summer, they've again agreed to operate the facility, and Circle One, their floating freezer, will also be docked in Metlakatla. With an increased local labor force, they expect production to be closer to 10 to 15 million pounds of fish this year. With that, I'll pass it back to Francis to talk about all-time impact.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, our all-time impact. So we've been tracking our impact since our very first cohort in 2016. I joined in early 2018 and set up our metrics program and backtracked a little to capture those first couple of years. So these numbers really are reflective of the last 9 years of our work. I do want to mention that this all-time impact you see on the slide is specifically looking at our portfolio companies and our tech deployment track. So that's our main program at Launch Alaska and the main way we track our success. However, we do have work outside of tech deployment track, such as the work our deployment team does directly with businesses and communities, and also our policy and advocacy work. And both of those will be counted in the metric I'll share on the next slide. But for now, we're just talking about portfolio company impact. So we've had 107 companies go through our accelerator program. In the early years, we had only a couple in each cohort, and lately we've often had 10 or more. And this past year, as I mentioned, we had 11 companies at the start of our program. Our portfolio companies have created 77 net jobs in Alaska. So this includes when our companies have to lay off people or reduce staff size. So this is the net jobs added. And 33 were added just in the last year. So this number is going up really quickly. About 20 of those were a result of the Circle Seafoods project that Matt just shared with you. And the rest were spread out across several different companies. 90 total projects have been awarded in Alaska for our portfolio companies, with 16 awarded in 2024. And that 16 includes 2 that Matt shared, so Metlakatla with Circle Seafoods, and then Cache Energy's project in Anchorage, alongside 14 others. And these contribute to the larger impact number I'll share on the next slide. Our portfolio companies have raised $655 million in funding after going through our program. So this includes federal funding, grants, investment dollars, venture capital, corporate investment, IPO, etc. So any funds raised. And 342 million of that was raised in 2024 alone. You might wonder why that number is so high. You know, that's half of what we've raised since the beginning. 306 million of that was due to one of our portfolio companies, Oklo, an advanced nuclear company that had an IPO last year. So that accounts for that huge jump. But again, that still leaves 36 million raised just in the last year by the rest of our portfolio companies. So that still counts for a few big raises and many smaller ones down to, very small grants, all adding up to that additional 36 million. Our portfolio companies have reduced 1.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions, and 149,000 of that occurred in just the last year. So you might have no idea, what does that mean? What is 1.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent? So to put that in perspective, that would be like taking 300,000 cars on the road for a year, be 1.4 million metric tons. So 149,000 metric tons would be like taking 30,000 cars off the road for 1 year. So, how do our companies calculate that? We ask them to share lifetime CO2 equivalent emissions reduction. So based on products and services that they sold in the last year, what will be the lifetime emissions reduction from that product or service? So this is a fairly standard industry way to measure CO2 impact, and that's the way that we've been tracking it. I'll also share that this number is really hard for many of our companies to calculate. They're lean startups. They don't have the resources in-house or finances to pay for it to calculate this number. And they know they're reducing emissions. They just don't know how much. So this number is actually much larger than 1.4 million metric tons. We just don't have the data for most of our companies. So in the last survey, I went back and checked, only 5 out of our 41 companies actually reported out on this statistic. So our emissions reduction is actually much higher than 1.4 million metric tons. We just don't have that data yet. And we have seen over the years, more companies reporting out on this or trying to, and we're working to improve this. So we've helped some of our portfolio companies directly think through these calculations to figure out their emissions reductions and to get a better estimate. But it's often hard to do this unless the companies are required through an investor or a grant, which we do see sometimes. So we have many more than just these 5 metrics that we track, but these are just a small selection of those metrics. And then the last one I'll share with you is our one main goal, which I've kind of mentioned a few times now, but we established our one main goal in 2020 that we measure our impact by. And that goal is to support the development of 1 billion in climate tech projects in Alaska by 2030. So far, as of the end of 2024, we've supported the development of 754.6 million in climate tech projects in Alaska. So that's a really big number. What does that mean? What does it mean that we've supported the development of these projects? How do we define that? It means that we helped make it happen. We were instrumental in that project getting completed. So still, you're probably wondering, what does that mean? What are you counting? What's your involvement in those projects? What kind of projects are counted towards this? So we've broken down those projects into 3 types: portfolio, deployment, and advocacy projects, to help you understand what supporting the development of one of these projects might look like. So portfolio projects, those count any portfolio company projects in Alaska that occur after they've gone through our program. So we want to track any work that our portfolio companies are doing in the state where dollars are going directly to that company. So company XYZ installs solar panels in a community in Alaska and gets paid by that community for the solar panels, money going directly to a portfolio company. So that's one example of a portfolio project. The next category is deployment projects. So those are projects in Alaska that our team at Launch Alaska is working on directly and being paid for that work. So let's say we're contracted by a utility to do an energy assessment, and Launch Alaska is paid directly by that utility for our work. We would count that as a deployment project. Advocacy projects are projects that we've helped make happen, but there's no money coming directly to Launch Alaska or to a portfolio company. So for example, let's say we made an introduction to 2 key parties that then worked together and deployed a project down the line. So those are our 3 project types: portfolio, deployment, and advocacy. So now on the impact piece, on this 754.6 million, you're probably wondering, what do we count as impact towards that number? How are we adding up that number and calculating it? So we're looking at a few things here. We're looking at the dollar value of those projects. So the direct value of portfolio projects in Alaska and deployment projects supported by Launch Alaska staff. So money being paid to the portfolio companies in Launch Alaska and anyone else working on the project. So the full project size, not just what's coming to Launch Alaska or the portfolio company. So that's the dollar value of the projects. And then looking at the impact side, we also count the estimated future value of projects unlocked through this work. So for example, if a portfolio company installs a microgrid control system that enables the deployment of a new renewable energy system, we count the value of the microgrid control system and the estimated value of the renewable energy system that it makes possible. So an example, if the portfolio company was paid $500,000 to set up microgrid controls, and that enables the utility to install $2 million of solar panels the following year, we would count 2.5 million towards our 1 billion goal. So we're not doing any complicated economic development impact. We're really just counting the current project value and the value of future projects unlocked by the current work. So we're intentionally keeping the definition broad and counting the dollar value of actual work. Okay, so now that we've defined what support means and what we're counting towards impact, let's break down this number in the next few slides. So this number is comprised of 84 unique projects ranging in size from a few thousand up to over 100 million for a single project. And you might be wondering why the previous slide said 90 projects, if you'll remember, and now I'm saying 84. So we count just the parent projects here, and many of them incorporate multiple portfolio companies and Launch Alaska. So if we have a project and a portfolio company, 3 portfolio companies, A, B, and C, are all working on that project, then we would count 3 projects on the previous slide towards that 90 awarded projects number. And for this number, we would only count 1 project, just to make sure that we don't double count the total impact, because the total impact of that project would remain the same whether we had 1 portfolio company working on it or multiple. Also in the previous slide, we're only focused on portfolio projects, while when we're counting towards this bigger number, we're looking at work Launch Alaska is doing separate from portfolio companies and also advocacy work. And so you can see that because this number, 84 projects, is still smaller than previous slide where we were calling out 90 projects, there's still a lot of projects we're working on with our portfolio companies, which we really see as a big success. We're doing a lot of work with multiple portfolio companies per project. So this is really exciting. This is how we want it to work. Okay, so finally, if we want to break down those 84 projects across our verticals, you can see about half are energy projects. So 44 projects, 30% transportation, and 18% industry. And so that's weighted by project count. If we then look at that same vertical breakdown, but weighted by dollars, it's very heavily skewed towards transportation. We have some really large projects added, mostly in the last year, that make up the majority of that transportation work. We can also break down this data by project type. So looking at the dollar value across advocacy, deployment, and portfolio projects. So you can see about 67% is advocacy work, which makes sense. These are really big projects that we helped make happen, but haven't been involved in directly financially. And this is really a huge part of the benefit of Launch Alaska. We help unstick projects, introduce people, move these big climate projects forward by getting the right people in the room together and advocating for them. And then 20% of our impact by dollar is made up of portfolio projects, and then 13 deployment. This is the last graph I'll share. So this is a breakdown by year, showing cumulative impact by year. And it's clearly a hockey stick graph going way up at the end, showing that we add more and more each year. Particularly in this last year, we've jumped by hundreds of millions of dollars, and that is largely due to a few large transportation advocacy projects. But this is what we expect. So in order to meet our $1 billion goal, we need to add 100 million in impact each, or about 100 million in impact each year. And so if we keep this up, the current progress will blow by that number soon and need to set a new goal for ourselves. But of course, that would be great. We'd love to set a new goal and go quickly past this 1 billion. So that is the last graph I'll share. I'll close by saying we're really proud of these numbers. They represent dollars spent and earned in Alaska, good paying jobs for Alaskans, progress towards our vision of prosperous and resilient communities that are rich in economic opportunities and sustainable systems. So we're starting to build real momentum, and we look forward to sharing even more progress with you next year. And with that, I will open it up for questions. So you can ask your questions using the Q&A function. We don't have the chat live on this webinar, so please submit your questions through the Q&A. And my colleague Matt will be joining me and answering questions if you have any more for kind of the deployment or portfolio side of things. And Kirsten will be managing questions as they come in. So Kirsten, do we have any questions to kick us off?
We do, Francis. Our first question: how long on average does it take Launch Alaska portfolio companies to secure a project in Alaska?
Thanks, Kirsten. Great question. So yeah, we want portfolio companies to be ready to deploy when they join the program. And we require companies to have at least have a potential project, what I mentioned with the project maps, before letting them into the portfolio. So after that, it's still, it does take some time after that to get the project awarded. So we actually looked into this last year and calculated kind of on average how long it took for each of our portfolio companies to go from the start of the program to having a deployed project. And we found that it took on average about 2 years for companies to secure a project from when they start TDT. So they start with session 1, turn those into fleshed out projects, project maps, and then it takes about another year after that on average to have an awarded project. So of course, some, in very rare cases, some have had an awarded project even before the program ends or shortly after. And then for some companies, it takes several years. But to answer your question, on average, about 2 years.
Great. We have some more questions coming in. Next up, what kinds of new jobs are being created by portfolio companies?
Thanks. Yeah, so we had 33. I mentioned we had 33 jobs added last year. And I mentioned many of these were from Circle Seafood. So a lot of those jobs in Metlakatla are fish processing jobs. And so a lot of those are seasonal jobs for the summer, but Matt and I chatted with Charlie yesterday, and he mentioned that they'll be hiring that many and many more next summer actually too. So I think he said almost 80 jobs next summer. So even though they're seasonal, they'll be coming back next summer. And then beyond that, the other jobs are across a variety of other skill sets, data engineers, mechanical engineers. A lot of our companies actually had interns from University of Alaska, which is exciting. So some local students were hired at our portfolio companies. So yeah, pretty broad spectrum for those jobs.
Our next question: what's the breakdown of portfolio companies by origin? For example, Alaska, the rest of the US, and international.
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, did you say portfolio companies or cohort or?
Yes, portfolio.
Portfolio. Okay. Yeah, so majority of our portfolio companies are from outside of Alaska. We have a few international, we have a few from in Alaska, and then the rest are kind of spread out over the US, kind of all over, several in California, East Coast, Washington. Yeah, but majority are kind of spread out around the US with a few international and a few from in Alaska.
Great. Our next question, how has AI impacted your funding, application, and iteration schedule?
That's a good question. I don't think it's had a big impact in terms of our funding, et cetera. I would say we're seeing, where we're seeing impact of AI is maybe in the companies that join our program or applicants. We've seen more applicants that are using AI in their tech. We've seen that tick up for a number of years. I don't know, Matt, if you had any more you want to say about that.
No, that's exactly what I was going to call out as well. We certainly see trends year over year in terms of what types of companies are applying to tech deployment track and are ready to deploy their technology. That's really one of the things we're seeking when we're picking who's a good fit. And this year we saw many applicants with a variety of AI-driven applications included in their technology offerings. So that's probably where we see the most impact.
Great. Our next question, how many of your 41 portfolio companies currently have projects in Alaska?
Yeah, I can take that one. So about 50% have projects in Alaska, and we're really proud of this stat. So all 41 companies are pursuing projects in Alaska and have project opportunities, and 50% have awarded projects already in Alaska. So yeah, we're proud of this stat, but we always hope it will keep going up.
Great. Another question. How is Launch thinking through the federal funding cuts and freezes in terms of helping portfolio companies whose Alaska deployment is funded by federal grants?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one, of course, we're all thinking about a lot right now. So we're always thinking about new ways to provide funding to portfolio companies even before the latest federal funding cuts. That's often what holds projects back, is just finding funding for them. So I think now we have even more of a focus on that. We're thinking through ways to help them through kind of investment on that side of things, and then also kind of direct project funding. I don't know, Matt, if you had anything else you wanted to add there.
The only other thing I'll add is that changes in the amounts of federal funding is not new. There's periods where there's more and periods where there's less. And one of the things that we're always trying to help our portfolio companies and companies coming through tech deployment track focus on is the value they bring to their end customer, to their project partner, to the community they work with. And while certainly grants and funding can help, particularly when you're deploying newer tech, there's still lots of things out there and lots of places in Alaska to deploy technology where it has value that stands alone, even without outside support.
Great. We have some more questions coming in now. What makes or who makes a good community partner for Launch Alaska companies? Is there a way to increase the number of organizations willing to work with Launch Alaska companies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I'm just looking at it in the chat. Thanks. Yeah, so we have, as I mentioned, this past session one, we had 51 volunteer advisors. Those are all our community partners. So many of those are, the ones that you saw on the partnership slide I shared. So a lot of what makes a good community partner is a company that would be a good advisor for our companies, so that they have expertise in energy, industry, and transportation. They can provide technical expertise and advice for how to deploy in Alaska. So really having that specific knowledge about Alaska so that they can help companies who may not be from here. That would be something that's useful. If they're actual asset owners and able to purchase or contract with our companies and work directly with them, of course, that's what we're looking for. At the end of this all is helping really deploy projects in Alaska. So if they can unstick projects and help our companies actually deploy and sell their tech here, that is really helpful as well.
Great. Next question. What kind of advocacy work do you include in your accounting towards the $1 billion number? Can you share some examples?
Yeah, I'll let Matt answer this one. Thanks.
Sure. So as Francis mentioned, advocacy is really the newest category for us. And so in some ways, we're still exploring and firming up exactly the types of projects that make sense to include here. What we know for sure is it includes some of our policy work, both at the state and federal levels of government, as well as more regional efforts, be that municipal or local politics. It also considers, as Francis kind of described, work where we support an organization in their planning and strategic outlooks. And especially if that leads to kind of larger projects, not for launch, not for a portfolio company, but large infrastructure is really the place where we've seen this kind of huge jump in our advocacy number over this past year. A lot of that was through work we have been doing to support the Department of Transportation and Public Facilities. And we worked with them on their carbon reduction plan. That plan led to a number of transportation infrastructure projects being identified and in some cases started in the statewide transportation improvement program, the STIP. And we counted some of those projects in our advocacy category this year. So things like low and no emission electric buses and charging stations, the NEVI program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. These are examples of things that dollars didn't flow to launch or to a portfolio company, but we certainly played a role in helping that to all come together.
Excellent. Next question. What is the role of public-private and collaborations or industry partnerships with the University of Alaska?
Matt, do you want to maybe take that one as well?
Sure. I think it goes without saying, Francis kind of alluded, like we had 51 volunteer advisors last year, and that's a whole mix of different people and from different organizations. A huge part of our offering at launch to these companies that want to come up and deploy, but also to stakeholders in the state is our ability to make linkages and make connections, and to use Francis's analogy, kind of get the right people in the room. So that crosses all sorts of different types of organizations. University of Alaska and that kind of research capacity, but also expertise and technical expertise is hugely valuable, and we often have at least one advisor from kind of research and the university and academia participating, if not many in a given year. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Next question. What are examples of ways portfolio companies are reducing emissions? What contributed to that 149,000 metric tons of CO2 reduction last year?
Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, I think it's helpful. The most helpful way to sort of understand this is probably to give a few examples of what our portfolio companies are doing. So let's see. One example, Blue Ocean Gear is a portfolio company of ours. They make smart buoys with real-time tracking. So they save boats and they save boats a lot of runtime kind of looking for buoys. And so with that, they're directly saving fuel and reducing emissions through that saved or avoided fuel. So that's a pretty direct example, save diesel and reduce emissions from that saved diesel. Another example from just this last year, who's submitted this data going towards that 149,000 metric tons, is Ampere. So they're an electric aviation company, and they're replacing jet fuel with electric flights. So again, reducing fuel use, and pretty directly they're saving CO2.
Excellent. Thank you, Frances. Our next question is, how did Launch Alaska assist its portfolio companies in raising $342 million in 2024?
Thanks, Kirsten. Yeah, that's a great question. So we did, in the early days of Launch Alaska, we did have 2 small investment funds totaling just a few million, and we would invest $75,000 into companies that joined our program. So a very small portion of that 340, or sorry, not 342, but the larger number is from direct Launch Alaska investment, the 655 million. But the vast majority of that all-time number and the 342 million in this last year is not directly from Launch Alaska. It's from outside investors, funders, grants that we're not directly involved with. We do have an investor program where we introduce portfolio companies and investors through a few different ways. We have a quarterly deal digest. We've also held investor days in the past where we do one-on-one meetings between portfolio companies and investors in a pitch style event. We also have one main partnership with an investment firm called Earthshot Ventures. And so if our portfolio companies are ready to meet with them or interested in a connection, we'll introduce them and see if they could be a fit for investment. But again, largely these funds are raised outside of the work that we're directly doing. And we're just proud to have helped them continue along and move forward during their time in our program, and then kind of recognize and track the huge strides that they've made after going through our program.
Great. And we have another question now. Can you share more details about what specific expertise the 51 volunteer advisors offer to your cohort companies?
Yeah, I can start this one, Matt, and I'm sure you can also speak to this. So yeah, they often have a specific expertise in, as I mentioned, energy industry, transportation. And then, during session 1, they're watching the pitches from our companies and providing feedback, answering questions, like really picking apart their tech, which we love for them to do. Yeah, and Matt, I'll pass it to you if you want to talk about that in more detail.
Yeah, for sure. There's lots of companies that are joining and participating in our program and tech deployment track that have never deployed in Alaska, or maybe even a cold climate before. So there is a whole slew of Alaska specific knowledge and expertise that's not directly related to a given company's widget that is really valuable in helping them to deploy. So we have some advisors who are very specific and work on one kind of subcategory or have one specific focus. We also have a number of more generalists who just understand the landscape of building and deploying technology or projects in the state. And both of those categories are very valuable to a startup or small company that's looking to deploy somewhere in a new market for the first time and wants to understand the landscape and succeed.
Excellent, thank you. That brings us to the end of the questions in the Q&A, unless anyone has any final questions. That looks like it might be it.
Okay, thanks for helping with that, Kirsten. So that brings us to the end of today's presentation. You can visit us at launchalaska.com to learn more about our work and our impact. Also sign up for future events. You can also reach out to me directly at frances.ball@launchalaska.com. I love talking about this stuff. I love getting into the details on impact. So I would love to, chat one-on-one with any of you. And a recording of this webinar will also be available on our website later today. So thank you all so much for joining us. You have a great day.